potentially worked over in Australia, maybe in the last mining boom, or potentially are looking essentially now to move over to Australia to start to work in some of the exploration sectors that are happening and very much booming in Australia. I live in Queensland, and Queensland is definitely one of the locations where the resources sector, specifically with respect to exploration, is definitely booming at the moment. And I know that there's a huge skill shortage. A lot of you have contacted me directly on LinkedIn as a result of a post that I was tagged in, where I assisted a gentleman from PNG to come over to Australia and work for an exploration company here in Queensland. So I am very thankful that he has now landed and he has started work, and he's loving being back in Australia. So I will get started. As I mentioned earlier, some of you weren't on yet, but there is a chat box that is available. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the seminar. I want this to be a bit of education for each of you to understand exactly how visas work in Australia, and how I might be able to assist you, or how you might be able to start getting ready even before a visa or job opportunity is available to you. So please do ask questions, and as I mentioned, you would have all received an email from me last night just as a reminder for the webinar today. So everyone does have my email address. So if you have any questions, please reach out. All right, let's get into it. So an introduction. So my name is Rachael Bosnjak. I've been practicing immigration law for over 10 years in Australia. I have worked at some very large organisations, and I have worked at also some very small ones. As a part of my work, I have worked a lot with the resources sector, a lot with the mining sector, and given advice and assisted people with visas to Australia. I have recently started my own immigration law practice in Australia, which is called Passage Migration Consulting. And Passage Migration Consulting essentially does what I've been doing for 10 years. So assist people to get visas to come to Australia. But what I really wanted to focus on was giving people education and knowledge around the visas that are available, and so that they can make the best decision for them. I appreciate that it's probably sometimes a little bit of a scary, to travel all the way to Australia without really knowing what's going to happen, potentially bringing a family, a partner, even a child, and then, kind of getting here, having a visa for 2 years or something like this, and then not really knowing what's going to happen next. So what I do in my practice is that I try and help you understand exactly what the future is going to look like and how you might be able to plan for it. So that's a little bit about me. I'm now going to turn the camera off because I'm sure you've seen enough of my face now, and I'll get started with the rest of the presentation. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today essentially is the Australian exploration industry, just as a little bit of a, bit of an overview, bit of an understanding of where things are currently at and what the industry is saying about the skill shortages that we're facing over here. I will also talk to you about visa opportunities. So for me, a visa opportunity is any different type of visa that you could get to come to Australia. A few tips on how to find a job, and then a few tips on how to get prepared when you're looking for those jobs. I know that each of you have probably applied for jobs in the past, and you probably have applied for jobs in Australia potentially, but this is really just based on my experience, just to give you a little bit of an understanding of what I see at the other end for employers when they're trying to choose candidates. So first things first, the Australian exploration industry, as I'm sure many of you will know, is huge. So these maps I've pulled from the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. So on the left, this is all of the places throughout Australia, as you can see, which is pretty much everywhere in Australia, where we've got critical minerals that are being explored, that are being extracted, that are essentially being researched for the good of Australia, for the good of the world. And on the right-hand side, we've got all of the resources sections throughout Australia, or the provinces, that are expected to kind of be explored over the next few years. So as you can see, these maps, the the places around Australia, the locations around Australia, and just the sheer amount of land space in Australia really means that the Australian exploration industry is quite big, which means that there is a very high need for lots of people to be able to help that have experience in the same types of minerals that we do, the same types of resources that we extract, all of these things. So this is really just a bit of to give you a little bit of an understanding as to what's currently happening at the moment. What the industry is saying. So I work a little bit with the Queensland Exploration Council, and I know that from a panel that I sat on at the end of last year, there is definitely a skills shortage in Australia, or a labour shortage in Australia for skilled workers that are working generally in the resources sector. Because today we're specifically talking about geologists, geophysicists, geotechnical engineers, all the things that go along with the geology side of mining. These quotes are directly linked to geosciences in Australia. So, people are saying that the commodities industry in Australia is essential, and it definitely has long-term career prospects. So but tied into that, essentially, the difficulty that we're facing is that a lot of our universities in Australia are removing the study of geological sciences and moving towards more earth sciences in Australia. So that is meaning that we're getting reduced amount of new talent coming through the geology sector. In addition to that, obviously, as everyone's painfully aware, we've just been through and sort of coming out the other end now of the global pandemic of COVID-19, which has meant that usually where Australia would be bringing in workers from overseas, the borders were closed both internationally and locally. So that really stopped talent or skilled talent coming in from different parts of the world to be able to assist even our junior geologists try and be upskilled, or just trying to fill general skill shortages that we have in Australia. And then further to that is that we have an aging population of geo-related occupations in Australia. So it's a bit of a perfect storm at the moment. The borders were closed, universities were changing or removing courses. Our geo population is aging, and that's obviously not everyone, but certainly this is kind of what the research is saying. And all of those things have really combined to mean that there is a serious shortage happening over here in Australia. So happily for each of you, there is definitely jobs available. It's just being able to identify what's going to fit you and what company would be willing to support your application. So let's have a look at a little bit of a look about visa opportunities. So as I mentioned, a visa opportunity is essentially a visa that might be available to you for Australia. Now, Australia has lots of different visas, which I'm sure you're all very aware of, especially if you've been here in the past. Some of them are temporary visas, some of them are permanent visas. And what I want to do today is kind of identify a few of those ones, a few of the key ones that someone in a skilled worker position, such as yourselves, might uptake and use to come to Australia. So the first visa is the Subclass 400 visa. So the main criteria of this is that you're coming to Australia to undertake short-term, non-ongoing, highly specialised work. What does that mean? Essentially, you might be coming to undertake work on a specific project, and that project will eventually end, and you're probably not required to come back after that time. So this visa essentially allows you to come to Australia for up to 6 months and has fairly short processing times of generally up to 6 weeks. Now, obviously, everything that I give you throughout this seminar around visa criteria, around processing times, everything's very general advice because the landscape of immigration is constantly changing. And so if you were looking to come to Australia on a visa, I certainly wouldn't recommend you rely solely on the slides that I'll present today. It would just be a matter of me having a chat with you and making sure you fit specifically within the criteria that I'll present today. So the first one is that Subclass 400 visa. Now, companies are starting to use this a little more readily. And one of the reasons for this is that this has much shorter processing times than the next visa that we're going to visit. Obviously, getting you on the ground in less than in sort of 6 to 8 weeks, rather than getting you on the ground in sort of maybe 6 months, is a significantly different kind of conversation that you would be having with an employer. So the general evidence that you would need to start thinking about for this type of visa is that obviously your passport would need to be valid, and that's going to be a standard requirement for all of these visas, as is an up-to-date resume. So an up-to-date resume has everything that you've been doing up until today listed on your resume. You'd also need evidence of your recent or current work, evidence of your skills, so things like work references, your qualification certificates, and you'd also need to be invited by an Australian company. So that would be something that where someone like myself would come and assist, and I would provide the company with a little bit of a template as to how they might draft a invitation letter to invite you to come to Australia for that specific project. The next visa, some of you will be semi-familiar with potentially. If any of you have travelled to Australia, potentially pre-2017, pre-2018, you may have travelled to Australia on the old 457 visa. So the old 457 no longer exists, and it was abolished, and it has now been replaced by the 482. So the 482, or otherwise known as the Temporary Skills Shortage Visa, or the TSS Visa, has some very similar kind of aspects to it that the 457 did, but it did make some fairly significant changes, which I'll address on the next slide. So the main criteria of this is that you would need to be sponsored by a valid sponsor, you would need to personally meet the skill requirements, and your occupation would need to be on the skilled list. Now, the skilled list I'll get to on the next slide, but things have slightly changed from the 457 to the 482 around the skilled list. So this visa will allow you to stay in Australia for up to 4 years, and that'll be dependent on your occupation. And processing times could sort of be anywhere between 3 and 6 months. The Department of Home Affairs, which is our kind of immigration department in Australia, does estimate that it could take longer than that. Generally, where you're lodging an application that has all of the documents and it's kind of an easy application to say yes to, your processing time shouldn't be any longer than 6 months. But it's always good to try and identify, a worst case scenario at the very beginning, rather than sort of imagining that you're going to be in Australia in 3 months and then it takes 6. So the criteria for this one, the evidence for this one are very similar to the 400, except that you would need to show that you've absolutely got at least 2 years of relevant work experience. And then you've got these added requirements of having an employment contract, a position description, meeting an English requirement, meeting a health requirement, and meeting the character requirements. And one of the big things on this visa, and this was sort of something that only used to apply to certain occupations back on the 457, but now the 482 requires that every single company, for 99% of applications, that they are doing labour market testing for the role. Essentially, all that means is that the company that you're working for or is sponsoring you has tested the Australian labour market. So they've put a job ad up on Seek or LinkedIn, and they've tried to get Australians to try and fill the role. And where they haven't, they've then been able to hire people like yourselves to bring that talent in from offshore and fill the labour shortages that we have in Australia. So that's kind of, as a general, they're the two kind of general visas that are available from a temporary perspective. And if any of you kind of dealt with the 457 visa in the past, this slide's a little bit text heavy, but it's a good one. I will send through a copy of these slides, but it's kind of a good one just to remember some of the key things that happened from the 457 to the TSS. So the new occupation lists were introduced, and essentially what happened was some occupations were removed altogether. Some occupations were put on the medium to long-term skills shortage list, and some were put on the short-term skilled occupation list. Some were kind of kicked down all the way to just a regional occupation list. And then during COVID, the government also created this priority migration skilled occupation list. So all that meant really was that it pulled occupations from some of the other lists and put them on a special one where we were facing very serious kind of skill shortages. At the moment, one of the geo roles is on there, on the priority skilled list. So if you happen to be in that role, you would potentially get priority processing. One of the other things that happened when the 457 changed to the TSS, the permanent visa age reduced from 50 to 45. What all of these changes meant essentially is that there was a lot of people that were in Australia, had dreams of kind of being in Australia on a permanent basis, and then ended up losing their ability to apply or even be eligible for a permanent visa. So even though there was a bit of a grace period, that grace period has now ended. But there has been a new announcement, which some of you might be aware of, that potentially brings some of the, the people that were previously eligible back into the light and potentially having access to now a permanent visa. So that's basically the kind of changes. I will later in the slides identify from a specific geo perspective which of the occupations in your field are on the medium to long-term skill shortage list and which are on the short-term skilled occupation list. And then that'll give you a bit of an idea to understand how many right at this moment, and these things could change from, occupations have been known to move between lists. You could potentially have access to either a 4-year visa with access to permanent residency or a 2-year visa with access to one more 2-year visa in Australia, but no access really to a permanent visa. So it really depends on where you're at, and that table later on in the slides will give you a bit of an understanding as to where you are personally going to fit and how you might be able to plan sort of moving forward. Okay, so the 3-step process for a 482 visa or the TSS. The first thing is the sponsorship. So the first one is that the Australian business that you're wanting to work with or that has offered you a job would need to apply for a sponsorship. So don't be scared of this one. Don't be scared of asking. Don't be scared of mentioning that it's a requirement. Because there are many, many businesses, especially in the resources and exploration sector in Australia, that are willing or already have a sponsorship in place. So the sponsorship essentially requires that the business is actively and lawfully operating. And while the requirements aren't overly onerous, sometimes it's just a little bit of a gathering of documentation. And if companies kind of don't really understand what they're getting themselves into, then they might be a little bit nervous. So again, that's where maybe someone like me might come in, explain to them exactly what their obligations are and how they, how they're going to be able to support you and what's going to be expected of them as a company to be able to sponsor workers in Australia. The second part of that is the nomination. So once they've got this kind of overarching sponsorship, they can then nominate a bunch of people, if they like, to be workers coming into Australia that don't have Australian passports. So the nomination, they would say, I need a geologist to come to work in Mount Isa on this particular location. We've tested the Australian labour market and what we're going to pay is going to be in line with the Australian what geologists are being paid in Mount Isa. And this is the employment contract and this is the candidate that we have identified. So then they'll choose, one of you, hopefully, and that nomination will be put forward to the government and the government will go through all of the criteria and tick off each one as they go. The third step then is that you essentially answer the nomination. The nomination is, and that's with the visa application. So in the visa application, you then get your opportunity to say, these are my skills and this is why I can do the job that, my sponsoring employer needs me to do. And this is why I'm the right person for the job. Here's a copy of my bachelor or my qualification. Here's all my work experience for the last 5 or 10 years. Here's my clear health and my clear character tests. And these are all the things that I've done. And then I should be the person then to, undertake the work. So it is a 3-step process. Each of those steps can all happen on the same day at the same time, which is okay. And they will generally, this process usually takes a little bit of time to prepare and then for processing times to kind of happen. So pre-COVID, when the world was a little less crazy, the processing times were kind of no more than 4 to 6 weeks. The processing times for this whole scenario at the moment, I would from putting you on a project perspective and making sure you're actually, boots on the ground at a certain time, I would estimate that this could take 3 to 6 months. And I would always be, open and upfront with, you and an employer to make sure that when they're doing, so when employers doing workforce planning, that they're not trying to put you on a project ahead of time without, sort of considering how long it's going to take for you to get here. So that is generally the 482 process. That's okay, Matthew, no worries. So that's generally the 482 visa process. And if some of you have been through 457 before, it's pretty much the same. There's just a few little added criteria where everyone needs to give a few extra documents from a company perspective, but also from an individual perspective. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the permanent visas. Now, I know some of you are chomping at the bit and so excited to try and talk about permanent visas and how a permanent visa might get you to Australia, especially if you have recently seen the new announcement that has come out. And the new announcement essentially potentially opens up the door to give access to permanent visas to people that lost that ability as a result of the 2017-2018 changes to the 457 visa, which created that TSS visa. So these are the permanent visa options. Now, some of these are employer sponsored and some of these are also independent options. You might not have access to all of these. And again, it is dependent specifically on your occupation, because where your occupation sits on the occupation list is directly indicative of what visas you're going to be eligible for and how you might be able to, proceed in Australia with a visa. So the first one is employer sponsored. This is the subclass 186 visa. So the criteria for this, unfortunately, it doesn't all fit on one side because there is different pathways, but you do, as a sort of standard criteria, it is employer sponsored and you need to meet health character in English requirements. So processing times for these ones, because they are permanent visas, could be 6 months or more, but generally you are applying for this visa once you get to Australia. So you're kind of already here, you're waiting for the visa in Australia rather than waiting in your home country to get a permanent visa to come here. So like any of the visas, you obviously need a valid passport to apply, but then your further evidence is really dependent on each pathway. So let's have a look at the pathways. So these are really the three main ones at the moment. So up until literally 2 weeks ago, only pathway 1 and 2 on this slide existed. Now, as a result of this new government announcement, pathway 3 has opened up, which is pretty exciting. So the first pathway is this temporary residence transition, which is the standard pathway. So this is 3 years with the same employer working in Australia in one of the occupations on the medium to long-term skill shortage list. So that means that someone like a geologist, for example, that falls on the short-term skilled occupation list, they wouldn't have access to this visa because they don't fall on that particular occupation list. Then we've got the direct entry option, and this one requires that you have a skills assessment in your occupation and at least 3 years of relevant work experience in an occupation, again, on the medium to long-term skill shortage list. Again, poor geologists kind of fall off the map a little bit here as well. So what this means for someone like a geologist, so the temporary residence transition stream under the new announcement means that the first thing that changed was that people that held a 457 visa in the past, and that was around so if you held a 457 visa on the 18th of April 2017, or you had applied for one on that day and it was subsequently granted, then you may fall under this new announcement. Similarly, if you were in Australia and held a 457 visa between the 1st of February 2020 and the 14th of December 2021, and you were in Australia and spent time here for at least 12 months as the holder of a 457, this announcement may affect you as well. And also, if you held a 482, so that's the new version of the 457, and you're again in Australia for at least 12 months between the 1st of February 2020 and the 14th of December 2021. So the great thing about this new announcement is that there is no specification on which occupation list can fall under this pathway. So it does not specifically say it has to be on the medium to long-term skill shortage list. So where it doesn't expressly exclude you, that means that you could potentially be included. So this is all applicable from the 1st of July 2022. And like anything in immigration land in Australia, as soon as something new is released, everyone wants to jump on board and make it happen as soon as possible. But unfortunately, there's not too much other than that kind of basic information. There's not too much other information that's quite available just yet. So generally what happens in Australia around immigration announcements is that the announcement will get made. The first piece of legislation that's called a legislative instrument will be created, and that gives us kind of the basics as to what to look out for. And then there'll be some backup kind of legislation or policy or guidance around who's actually going to fall under this. So if you think, or if you know that you were in Australia as the holder of a 457 or 482 between the 1st of February 2020 and the 14th of December 2021, and you're in any occupation that doesn't necessarily fall on the medium to long-term skill shortage list, then you might have access to a permanent visa, which would be super exciting. So for anyone that kind of falls into that category, and really any other permanent visa category, I would do a proper assessment to make sure, because it is quite a big process to go through, and that's definitely not something that you want to get wrong, and you want to make sure you get it right the first time. So that's generally the subclass 186 pathways. All of these need the support of an employer. All of these need that employer to be actively and lawfully operating a business. All of these need that you have a valid employment contract, a position description, evidence that you've been working with this employer, and that you're meeting the health, character, and English requirements. So the next one is the 189 visa. So the 189 visa is currently limited mostly to the medium to long-term skill shortage list. And what happens in this process essentially is three things. So the first thing is that you lodge, as an individual, lodge an expression of interest. So an expression of interest essentially is a form that you fill out, and it's a points-based test essentially. So as in your role, you've obviously got work experience, you've had qualifications to get to your to where you are. You may have done an English test. You may have even done a skills assessment. So the expression of interest brings all of those things that you've done together and puts them all in one basic form, and then allocates points for each of the categories. So your skills, your experience, your English, potentially even your partner's skills, your partner's English, and then it spits out a number at the end. And the legislated number that it must be at the end is that you must have at least 65 points to apply, which was all kind of wonderful pre-COVID, because most people can score 65 points that, are professionals that have a fairly decent level of English, because you've had some work experience, you've got a bachelor, and you've done an English test. Most people can score 65. So in the days pre-COVID, the Australian government were issuing thousands of these invitations to lodge, which is our next step. So, but during COVID, as the Australian kind of population's unemployment rate was risen and got higher and higher, it meant that the invitations to lodge were reduced and reduced and reduced. And also what it meant was the number of points that someone needs to be invited to lodge an application significantly increased. And what that meant was, so we might have had, where we had thousands of invitations being issued, they were then issuing hundreds of invitations, but they were limiting the people that were getting those invitations to people that had maybe 90 points or 95 or even 100 points. That level of points is certainly more difficult to get. So, and that has kind of carried through the points testing for Australia. that has carried through what has happened with the 189 visa and also the 190, which we'll talk about next. The lowest point score in January 2022 for a geophysicist was 80 points. So, and the higher the better. So that kind of puts into perspective how things have sort of changed. That is absolutely not to say that you can't get this visa. And it is a visa where you don't need any support from a state or territory in Australia. You don't need any support from a employer in Australia. This is an independent skilled process. So your expression of interest is sort of, a formulated version of your resume. And around the time you do your expression of interest, you would also need to have done a skills assessment, which assesses your past skills and experience in your role. So once you've kind of ticked all those things off, so you've done an English test, you've done a skills assessment, you've got all your work references handy, everything's sort of ready to go in a pile. I always recommend you do all that first, and then you get your expression of interest in. Sometimes people might put an expression of interest in and then start to think about the documents later. My issue with that is, what if you get invited to lodge an application and you're not ready? So that's a little bit of that's just something to kind of think about. So once you get to the invitation to lodge stage, that essentially is an email from the government that says, hey there, you've been invited to lodge a 189 visa application and you've got 60 days to do it. So at that time, you've already got all your documents. In a perfect world, you've got all your documents ready to go. You prepare everything and then the visa application is lodged. So that is the 3-step process for the 189 visa. And I should say that, as a part of this expression of interest stage, it is that skills assessment is a mandatory requirement. So everyone would need to do that for this visa as well. The next visa that I want to kind of talk about is the 190 visa. Now, this is very similar to the 189 visa, but it has an additional step. So the 190 visa has the added step of a state or territory nomination. So you still lodge your expression of interest exactly the same way that you would with the 189, but you would nominate on your expression of interest the types of visas that you want to be considered for. And if you tick the box of the 190, we'll ask you which state or territory you would like to be considered for. And that state or territory then has its own requirements that you would need to meet to get invited by them to be, to be supported by them. So, for example, Queensland at the moment, so Queensland's state sponsorship body is Business Schools Migration Queensland. And at the moment, they are only open to providing invitations to people that currently reside in Queensland and have worked here for a certain period of time. Obviously not overly helpful to any of you that are currently potentially living outside of Australia, but that is something to consider. So just because you may want to live in Western Australia or Queensland or Northern Territory, you may not necessarily meet the state or territory nomination requirements. But what you could do is that you might come to Australia on a temporary visa, and then you could work towards the requirements that are required under the state or territory nomination to make your application as strong as possible. So once you then have the state or territory nomination, so what will happen is, again, you'll receive an email saying, hi, this is Queensland speaking. We would like to support your application for a 190 visa. Please send us, evidence that you meet our requirements. You would respond. They would then come back with a nomination and say, yes, we nominate this person to be able to lodge the 190 application in our state or territory. The next part of that, of course, is then that you need to be invited by the government to lodge that next part of the visa application. And it's generally where you've been nominated by the state or territory. It's fairly quick, so you should be invited fairly soon after. And then once you get your invitation, again, you've got 60 days and you would need to lodge the visa application. So as you can kind of see, where you're prepared at the very beginning of the process, both for the 189 and the 190, preparation always pays off. And that means by the end of the process, when you get to the lodgement of visa application, you would be ready to go with a strong application, with up-to-date documents, with clear information, all kind of, all provided and ready to put forward the best application for you. So that's the permanent visas, which is the subclass 186, which has those few different pathways. Then we looked at the 189 visa, which is an independent skilled option. And then we looked at this 190, which is very similar to the 189, but it does have the added requirement of this state or territory nomination. And the other difference with this visa is that the 190 visa isn't necessarily limited to which occupation list. So part of the requirements when you're thinking about state or territory nomination is to make sure that the occupation you are putting forward is on the state or territory nominations list. So if you are looking at moving to Victoria and you want to work as a geophysicist, if your occupation of geophysicist does not fit on their or is not listed on their nomination list, then you're unlikely to going to be supported by Victoria for that occupation. So that is something little to kind of to sort of think about as well. So that's the permanent visas. The next one. What I want to kind of show you is to give you a bit of an understanding of permanent visas and their availability by occupation. And this is strictly only to do with geo-related occupations. So this table will give you a bit of an understanding. So the first column is the occupation name and ANSCO code. I know you can all read, but still the occupation list that's going to be applicable to you. The permanent visa subclasses, so they're the numbers that have been in the slides throughout, and then the temporary visa length as to what you're going to get if you were to come to Australia on a 482. So as you can see, most of the occupations that you're all working in are likely to will already fall within that medium to long-term skill shortage list, and even some of you are currently sitting on that priority migration skilled occupation list. So for people looking at that other spatial scientist role, who fits within that role is essentially your geographical information systems people. And, you know, forgive me, I'm a lawyer, but my understanding of this role is that essentially these are the people that use technology and use software and use computers to essentially find the places where everyone else needs to go then and explore for the, you know, kind of geological formations that you're looking for. So I have recently done someone in that occupation. And his work experience is very impressive. He's kind of worked all over the world and done that kind of, you know, the computer side of geology, for one of a, you know, better description. So this kind of gives you a little bit of an understanding. And you'll see again, most of these occupations have access to pretty much all of the visas. Where you have access to a 190, you would still need to be on that state's list. So just kind of keep that in mind. And then for a geologist, the 186 is really only open to those limited people that we talked about earlier, where they might fit within this new announcement that has been made. Everyone else has pretty good prospects, or really good prospects. You have access to up to a 4-year visa in Australia. You have access to most of the permanent visas, both employer-sponsored and independent skilled, which kind of gives you a good understanding, you know, good ability to be able to start to plan what your life might look like in Australia if you were to take up a job here. So that's a good little quick guide. And if anyone has any questions on that or anything about other specific occupations, please do let me know. I'm going to keep on moving through though. So when you're looking for jobs in Australia, and some of this might be fairly obvious to some of you, but I know that a lot of you did specifically contact me on LinkedIn, and I kind of gave you a few hints as to the way that, you know, having worked with the industry for a little while now, there's some of the things that I, you know, think might be helpful to reach out to people to actually find where there's jobs and who's looking. So looking for jobs in Australia. So as a really good kind of understanding, if you have a look at this Australian job boards, I did this search this morning and I only did it for a geologist, otherwise this wouldn't have fit on the page. But in Australia at the moment, there are 782 jobs for geologists available, and that's on our seek.com platform. And then the other one, on the LinkedIn job boards, there are 293 roles available for geologists. So you can see just by those sheer numbers that there is a significant skill shortage or significant need for geo-related roles in Australia. So I did quick searches of some of the other geo-related occupations as well. They are very similar numbers. While they might not be as high, certainly there is a huge need for people in your role. I've also just put down here this job active board down the bottom. So a lot of people don't know what this job active board is. Essentially, this is a government, Australian government job search board. And by requirement for immigration purposes, companies that are looking to sponsor foreign workers must advertise their jobs or any jobs that they're looking for. They must advertise them on this job board. Now, this is not to say just because you apply for a job through this source, will you necessarily get a job, in Australia, but as a requirement, and also not to say that everyone that posts on this job board is looking for foreign workers, but it is a requirement from an immigration perspective for the nomination stage that all employers are using this job board. So that's a bit of a hot tip from behind the scenes. So if you're kind of overlooking on Seek and, LinkedIn is kind of getting, a bit much, maybe check out Job Active. It might be another source. The other thing that you can start to think about is industry organisations. So in no way am I affiliated with, any of these kind of organisations. Specifically, full disclosure, I am a member of the Queensland Exploration Council, but these organisations, act independently and they generally work with the industry in Australia. They all have different member bases, they have different purposes. But what you could potentially do is start to have a look at these organisations in Australia, find out who their members are, follow them on LinkedIn, have a look at the people that are liking their posts or commenting on their posts, or have a look at the people that are appearing in their posts. So, and those people are usually the owners of geo companies, the owners at exploration companies, the workers of exploration companies, all of these things. So that's just another way that I thought that you might be able to start to open up dialogue with companies in Australia. And then as a, kind of main point, with all of those things on this slide, just making connections. So I work with the industry. I am not a geologist company, but I do work with the industry and I do immigration work with the industry. And so, finding people, like me or other people that are connected with the industry in a different way, whether it be through these industry organisations, whether it be through your friends or family members that have come to Australia with exploration or geology or resourcing, they're the people to connect with. They're the people to kind of have a conversation with and tell them what you want to do in Australia. Tell them that you want to come to Australia and work and, show that kind of interest. So these are kind of just some, my basic hot tips on, what I think might assist you to when you're looking for work in Australia. So that's those. Then if we move on, then the final thing, what I thought I would kind of throw out there is a bit of a checklist for starting to think about how to apply for jobs in Australia and what the things that you need to consider from an immigration perspective if you're traveling from overseas. So the first thing is to write a strong cover letter with your job application. So if you're thinking, I really want to work in Australia, I really want to work on their resources sites or do exploration of this particular product, what you need to do is kind of put that forward. And I know that you're all professionals. I don't want to tell you how to apply for a job, but what I kind of have seen in some jobs within the industry is that people I literally saw a handwritten resume the other day, not for a geologist, but if, that kind of level of, effort to a job application is probably not high enough to get you a job, with a big company, for example, in Australia. Whereas if you've got a really good up-to-date resume, you've got a really good strong cover letter that outlines exactly who you are, what you do, and why you want to come to work in Australia, then you're going to stand out from the crowd especially considering if a company is thinking about filling a role, and you're a much more expensive prospect to hire because you're coming in from overseas, and companies will assist you and to get started in Australia and these things. So if you want to stand out, you need to make sure that you've got something that helps you kind of stand out from the pack. Obviously, your qualifications and work experience will speak for itself. And some of the resumes that I see that come from overseas are absolutely phenomenal. So I will not take that away from you, but it's just kind of making sure that you can, put something forward that's very, makes you very obviously the person for the role. Again, passport being up to date. I had someone come to me the other day and wanted to do a visa application, and his passport had expired a month ago and he didn't realise. So if you are looking for a job in Australia or anywhere else in the world for that matter, check that you have a valid passport. Australia is still requiring that you are double vaccinated for COVID-19 before you enter Australia, and you would need to provide evidence of that vaccination. Our quarantine has changed, and I believe that quarantine is no longer required, but all of these things are something that need to be checked prior to getting on a plane and coming here. You would not get on a plane without knowing exactly what's going to happen at the other end. The other thing is a resume that clearly demonstrates your work experience and qualifications. Again, something that most professionals are going to do, but I did just see a resume the other day that was handwritten. So outline your work experience, clearly indicate what your qualifications are and where they came from and when you got them. So it's very clear that you're going to be the person that can undertake that role. If your qualifications are not in English, and that happens a lot of the time when people are coming from overseas, get a copy of your certificate and your transcript, and get them translated. Know that you're going to have to give those at some point. Sometimes qualifications have a foreign language and then they also have English on them. In that case, you don't need to get them translated because the English words are already there. So just make sure that you check that before you go ahead and get them translated. And then start to gather work references. So if you're currently working or if you have worked in the past, start to gather work references that are clearly going to identify the work experience that you have undertaken already, because all that's going to do is show your current employer, or your new employer in Australia, what you can do, and it's also going to go towards your visa application. Then for pretty much everyone that comes to Australia, unless you have a US, New Zealand, English, Irish or Canadian passport, you're going to need to undertake an English test. If you have not done an English test in the last couple of years, then you would need to do an English test again. And dependent on the visa and dependent on the occupation list that you are on, your results required are going to be different. But as a general rule, if you could kind of look to get at least 5s in every band of an IELTS test, for example, that is definitely something to work towards. So that is the getting prepared sort of checklist, and hopefully that kind of helps you start to think about the types of jobs, the types of things that you would need to do to start to get ready for a job in Australia. So we've got a bit of time. We've got about half an hour. Does anyone have any questions? Obviously happy to take them offline as well. You can email me through questions. Does anyone have any specific questions that they'd like to ask while I'm still here? Okay. Hi, Matthew. Wonderful. Which states can sponsor a geologist under the 190? I know Queensland's doing it at the moment, but their requirement is that they are looking for people that have worked in Queensland. So that's obviously a little bit difficult unless you're in Australia. Other states, they change quite regularly. So off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly which states, but it's definitely something that, could be looked into if you were looking to try and, kind of get an assessment of whether or not you're eligible for the 190 for Australia. While Matthew's typing away, everyone else, I guess, just start to think about your personal situation as well. If there's anything that you want to raise, any confusion over anything I've said, please just jump in the chat box or even unmute yourself and just yell out exactly what you'd like to say. Were you typing another question then, Matthew? I think we've feel free to just unmute yourself and just yell out the question if that's easier. Is the visa restricted? Yes, it is restricted to a company in the sense that if you got the 482 visa, the TSS, so that because you've got that nomination is directly linked to a company. If though, and these things happen, if you would like to move companies during the course of your sponsorship, there is an ability to change the sponsor. So essentially a new nomination would need to be lodged for the purposes of your visa. For the vaccination, do they accept? Okay, Quinn, I think that answers your question. For the vaccination, do they accept all vaccinations? It actually lists the vaccinations that Australia accepts on the Australian COVID Department of Home Affairs COVID website. And that would be something that you could literally Google Department of Home Affairs COVID-19 vaccination, and it has a list of what's available. Just as a guideline, I've just had someone come in from Papua New Guinea, and the vaccination that he got there was fine to enter Australia. Anyone else? And out of interest, is everyone in Australia, outside of Australia? Yeah. Okay, Joseph is just sending us through a question, and once we have that one, I think, Joseph, are you sending through a question? If not, just feel free to yell out. If there's no other questions, we might close it there. Just so everyone is aware, this the session is recorded. It will be posted up to my or to the business's YouTube channel, so under Passage Migration Consulting. If for some reason you're not okay with that, please let me know via email, and I can make a somehow, you know, figure out what to do with that. Otherwise, please email me through any specific questions, you know, about you. And if we do need to do a further assessment of any of you, we can absolutely do that. I really appreciate all of you coming. You know, I know that most of you have somehow tracked me down on LinkedIn. So really appreciate you coming and listening. I hope it was really helpful for you. And if you'd love to, I'd love if you could leave a comment on the once it's posted up on YouTube, or even a review of the business on Google. If you really enjoyed today, that would be really, really appreciated. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to meet you all. I will hopefully be helping some of you come to Australia soon.